The Appalachian Mountains have a dark, dark secret. Beneath their serene beauty and endless wilderness lies a mystery that has haunted park rangers, hikers, and even the FBI for over half a century. In the summer of 1969, a young boy vanished just a few feet away from his family. A promising search was launched, but this quickly descended into absolute chaos, the details of which are so insane that you're probably gonna think that I'm lying to you. Of course, I'm not lying, but that doesn't mean that others haven't lied about this case. Let me tell you the story of what is probably the most dramatic disappearance in all of national park history. And by the time that you hear the end of this story, I'm gonna share something that a lot of you might not want to hear. Something that frankly might piss you off. So almost 2 years ago, I made a video covering the disappearance of Dennis Martin, and everything was fine with that video until a few weeks ago when I was suddenly forced to delete it due to some frustrating bureaucratic stuff related to YouTube. I won't go into that, but it was actually kind of a mixed blessing because when I went back and watched my original video, I realized that I actually left out a very, very important point that I now have a fresh chance to make. And so to start off our story, let's head together to the most visited national park in all of the United States, which is Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Now I'm taking you on this trip for free. All I ask is that you hit that subscribe button, especially if you're a repeat viewer and you've watched a few of my videos by now. You kind of know who you are. That's all I ask. Okay, so on Father's Day weekend in the year 1969, the Martin family left their home in Knoxville, Tennessee, and headed straight to the Smoky Mountains. The group consisted of 6-year-old Dennis, 9-year-old Douglas, their father Bill, and their grandfather Clyde. This trip to Great Smoky Mountains National Park was actually a family tradition, but Dennis, because he was so young, he had never gone before until now. This was going to be his very first time ever going camping. Dennis was about 4 feet tall and he weighed about 55 pounds. Now he had been on like a few day hikes before and he reportedly walked so fast that the adults couldn't always keep up with him, but he had never gone camping. But of course that didn't mean that he wasn't comfortable and happy in the woods, which by everything that people have said, he certainly was. He must have been very excited. The Martin family started their adventure from Cades Cove Campground on Friday, and from there, they hiked up to the Appalachian Trail, which kind of runs along the dividing ridge between the North Carolina and Tennessee state borders. On this particular day, it was perfect hiking weather, beautiful, sunny, and I'm sure that the group was just thrilled to get to their first campsite, which was the Russell Field Shelter. They spent the night there, and then the next day, they decided to take it kind of easy, only hiking a few miles north on the Appalachian Trail to their next campsite, which was Spence Field. They made their way down the trail, they reached Spence Field, and then, of course, they set up their camp. And something that's kind of interesting is that nearly 50 years later, I actually did the exact same thing in the exact same spot when I thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail. Though I will say, at the time, I had no idea about how infamous of a place Spence Field is. I might have rethought my decision had I known about the next series of events you're gonna hear about in this story. At Spence Field, the Martins were joined by some family friends, and sometime in the afternoon, the group kind of just sat down to relax. I mean, camp was set up, lunch had been consumed, and all the dishes had been done. So there really wasn't much else for the adults to do besides kind of just sit there and take in the scenery. However, for the young boys, they're not just gonna sit there and be still. It was playtime now, and the grassy knoll that they were camped on was pretty much the perfect spot for it. Dennis, Douglas, and 2 other boys that were with them hatched a devious plan to kind of sneak up on all the adults and surprise them. A prank, if you will. However, unbeknownst to the boys, the adults were onto them, They kind of just watched and laughed as the group of boys split up in different directions. Douglas and those 2 other boys went to the south, and Dennis, who was by himself, went to the north and west, kind of towards the Tennessee side of the ridge. Again, they're camped like right on the border of the two states. All the adults pretended to be surprised when the boys kind of jumped out at them, and rounds of laughter quickly followed. However, within no more than, say, 5 minutes, nobody was laughing, because it's by this point that everyone realized Dennis hadn't jumped out with the rest of the boys. He wasn't even around anymore. He was nowhere to be found. Dennis had basically vanished into thin air. And so, obviously, this is the point in the story where things are about to get quite disturbing. And so, before we get too deep into the dark stuff that's gonna come, I do just want to lighten the mood for a second and tell you about something that's actually kind of the opposite, something that's actually quite fun. And that, of course, would be Groons, who is the sponsor of this video. Now, the older I get, I'm now at the ripe age of 29, by the way, the more and more seriously I take my health. And one observation I've made is that many multivitamins and supplements, I mean, this is my opinion, but they're basically just a sugar-filled scam. Like, the ingredients in that stuff, it's not very good. Have you ever noticed that too? You probably have, but either way, I'm just very grateful that I found Groons, because they are dedicated to bringing comprehensive and real nutrition to myself and to you through their gummy bears, which are formulated from 60 nutrient-dense and whole food ingredients. I told you this was going to be fun, right? You can now eat gummy bears and reap benefits in your gut health, cognition, your energy, and more, all of that stuff at the very same time. Can we just pause for a second? I can't believe I just said that in a sentence. Like, what a crazy time to be alive, man. Keep watching if you want to save some money, by the way. 99% of other supplements are basically lazy, and they take an off-the-shelf generic blend that may actually be doing more harm than good. But Groons is totally different, because they make it a point to contain 100% of your daily needs for safe vitamins and only 25% of your daily needs for certain minerals that are known to be potentially toxic at excessive levels over an extended period of exposure. Groons gummies contain 6 times the gut health ingredients compared to the leading greens powders. They contain mushrooms, which can lower the chance of mild cognitive impairment, you know, things like brain fog, for example. And Groons is methylated, which means that all people, yourself included, can absorb the critical nutrients. A lot of multivitamins don't have that. And so with all that said, Groons is clearly not just another vitamin. They are something special. So click the link in the description or scan the QR code for up to 52% off your order, which is crazy. I mean, how often do you hear a deal like that? 52%. Click that link. You'll also be doing us a massive favor. Okay, let's get back to the video. So Dennis was wearing a red t-shirt on this camping trip, and it's because of this, you know, because red kind of sticks out, especially in nature. It's because of this that all of the boys planned for him to sneak around kind of on his own, away from them, so that he wouldn't, you know, just give them all away to the adults they were trying to surprise. But clearly that backfired, because nobody saw him disappear. And so when everyone realized that Dennis was gone, Bill and Clyde started kind of just calling out his name, but they heard nothing and saw nothing, for that matter, in return. Getting more and more desperate, they decided to just spring into action and began looking along the trails. Bill Martin in particular traveled south on the Appalachian Trail for about a mile before returning to Spence Field, you know, hoping that his son would be back by then. But when he realized that Dennis was still lost, Bill turned around and he headed south again, this time hiking the 2.5 miles all the way back to Russell Field, where they had camped the first night. But of course, once again, Bill ended up turning around, heading back to Spence Field without his son, and without any sign of his son either. While Bill was desperately searching along the Appalachian Trail, Clyde made his way completely off of the ridge. He hiked over 8 miles down back to Cades Cove Campground, where he reached a ranger station. Of course, this served one very important purpose, which was to report Dennis Martin missing, which is what he did at roughly 8:30 p.m. that night, which just so happened to be the day before the boy's 7th birthday. This marked the start of a search effort, which would turn more and more into a pardon my language here. I mean, I'm just going to say it. A show with each passing day. You're going to understand why I say that very shortly, but I'm getting ahead of myself. On this first night, the search was still quite limited, to be honest. In addition to all the searching that Bill and Clyde had done, rangers interviewed hikers at Spence Field who had, traveled in from various directions and various trails and stuff like that. However, none of them had noticed anything out of the ordinary, let alone actually seen Dennis himself. And then, that very first night, a massive storm rolled through the Smoky Mountains, dumping down almost 3 inches of rain in just the span of a few hours. This was obviously extremely unlucky for the search. I mean, the Smokies are known for their volatile weather after all, and they're technically a rainforest, but regardless of how normal this was, the thunderstorms were very, very bad news for the search, because not only did the weather stop everyone in their tracks, right at the most critical point of the search, mind you, but after the storm passed, it left Spence Field and the surrounding area a muddy, flooded mess. This would hinder the pace of searching the next morning and also potentially cover up important clues and evidence about where Dennis Martin could have ended up. And also, it brings me no pleasure to say this, but let's just be honest here, that weather could have killed the boy. I mean, without any shelter, he could have easily become hypothermic or been swept away in a flash flood, something horrible like that. And searchers knew that this could have been the case. But regardless, they had a job to do. And so the next day, they completely ramped up their efforts, and I don't say that lightly. By the afternoon, there was 240 people in the park searching for Dennis. At this point, his mother had also arrived after learning at church that her son was missing. I mean, how terrible is that? And if you thought 240 was a lot, well, wait till you hear this. So from there, the number of searchers started to balloon at a ridiculous rate. I mean, within a week, some 1,400 people, many of whom were volunteers, descended upon the Smoky Mountains, eager to find Dennis. Groups ranging from the Boy Scouts all the way up to the Green Berets showed up. I mean, helicopters were used, dogs were used, even loudspeakers were deployed. President Nixon even contacted park officials telling them that he would be following the search. Now, one might think that there's strength in numbers, and usually there is, but it's at this point that the search really started to just fall apart. A search effort of this magnitude had pretty much never been seen before, and organization was all but impossible. Some volunteers reportedly didn't know how to use a compass or other important searching tools, navigation tools. At one point, a volunteer searcher fell off of a bridge and broke his arm, requiring medical attention. Another searcher accidentally shot himself in the leg, requiring even more intense medical attention. And those Green Berets I mentioned, remember them? Well, they would end up hiking themselves so deep into the woods that they ran out of food and ended up killing and barbecuing a rattlesnake in order to sustain themselves. Retired park ranger Dwight McCarter was involved in the search from the morning after Dennis went missing, so almost from the beginning. And he said this, quote, "All those people, that's a lot of footprints. All those trucks, we searched and searched and searched. Something should have been found. But you have to know what to look for. Get just a few of us trackers in first and give us a chance." Nobody really saw it coming, but the fact that they had so many people searching and so many inexperienced and unorganized groups searching probably actually hindered the search effort rather than doing the opposite. And though this search was certainly a disaster, the obvious reason that so many people wanted to help is because, I mean, it's a 7-year-old boy after all. I mean, that's just terrible, right? It's a case that tugs at people's heartstrings. And so, I'm obviously criticizing the search efforts here. I do also want to just take a moment to acknowledge the heart and the determination that all of the searchers displayed, even if, it ended up hurting things ultimately. Despite so many people on the ground, this massive effort, Dennis Martin was never located. And in addition to that, hardly any evidence at all was found. It basically just seemed like he up and vanished, as if the Smoky Mountains simply just swallowed him whole. However, there was one potential clue discovered on day 4 of the search, and this was a clue that possibly gives us a glimpse into what might have happened to the missing boy. In the vicinity of Eagle Creek, which was roughly a mile away from where Dennis Martin was last seen, some hikers discovered suspicious-looking footprints leading off of a trail. They ended up following these footprints as far as they could, which was some 300 yards, we'll say, before finally kind of losing them at the edge of one of the many flooded streams in the area. But it's important to know that these weren't just any footprints that could have belonged to anyone. A close examination of the footprints provided evidence that they might have belonged to Dennis. First of all, one of the prints was from a barefoot, and then the other print was from a shoe. And of course, that would be consistent with a lost, desperate boy kind of roaming around the woods. And second of all, these prints were found at kind of a confusing junction, one with a water break there, and it kind of looked like a trail. And, it easily could have confused a child, and then, he could have followed it and then found himself completely lost in the wilderness, off trail. And the kicker when it comes to these footprints was that they were small. You could even describe them as child-sized. Searchers were very intrigued by this evidence, and so they made a cast of the prints. However, the Martin family felt as though these prints were too big for Dennis's feet. And after this, it didn't take long for an explanation to emerge, which was that the tracks were left by Boy Scouts, which kind of explains the small feet. And remember, the Boy Scouts were involved in the search efforts. And besides that, those Green Berets I told you about earlier would end up confirming that they had already searched the area where the prints were found. And they even insisted that they would have found Dennis if he was nearby. But then again, considering how much of a mess this search was, I find it hard to look back and completely discount the evidence that is these footprints. First of all, the prints were that of one single child, not an entire troop of Boy Scouts, right? And so that explanation doesn't really make sense to me. And also, there's no way that the Boy Scouts would have been searching without their shoes on through this difficult terrain. Like, I don't know, it doesn't really make sense, right? Like something's off about this. But regardless of my feelings on it, this clue, the only potential clue that resulted from this massive search, well, it was never properly followed up on. And so I can speculate all day about it, but we're just never really going to know how much validity it had. Now, you might be surprised to know that there were actually a few more clues into the disappearance of Dennis Martin, but all of these clues came in after the official search had already been suspended. So more than a month after the disappearance, a man came forward and claimed that while visiting Cades Cove on Father's Day weekend, he actually witnessed something kind of suspicious. The man claimed that he was hiking off trail, kind of just bushwhacking, and he was quoted saying, "When we got about half a mile or maybe 3/4 of a mile from the car, we heard a scream, a troubled scream, an enormous, sickening scream. We couldn't tell which direction it came from, but it sounded like it came from higher on the mountain to me. I looked across the creek and saw a man in the bushes. I couldn't tell much about him because he was going down the creek towards the cars. He was definitely trying to keep from being seen. I thought maybe he was a moonshiner." After seeing this man, the witness then allegedly discovered a homemade map where this mysterious man had been standing previously, and the witness also noticed that the man had likely driven off in a older model white Chevrolet. Now, this story sounds promising, right? But after investigating, officials would end up concluding that it was completely unrelated to Dennis Martin's disappearance. They actually believed that the man's location at the time was just too far away from Spence Field for Dennis to have possibly traveled there in the timeline that was presented. And thus, the second lead in the case hit a dead end, and it would unfortunately be years before the next lead would present itself. 16 years to be exact. In 1985, a man came forward and reported that he had discovered the remains of a small child in the area of Big Hollow, which is near Tremont, Tennessee, deep inside the national park. This discovery was supposedly made some 3 to 4 miles straight line from where Dennis Martin was last seen. When this was reported, the area was searched by up to 30 people, but once again, nothing was found. The man who made this report actually said that he had found the body like years earlier, but he didn't tell anyone at the time because he was out illegally hunting ginseng. You know, he didn't want to blow his cover there. And so by the time they actually went to search, they didn't find anything. And so this lead would also end up being a dead end. So with that said, what the hell could have happened to Dennis Martin? I mean, that's the big question here. And there's been a range of theories discussed over the years. I mean, it's possible that Dennis was the unfortunate victim of one of the thousands of black bears in the Smoky Mountains. Or, of course, maybe he was bitten by a rattlesnake, a copperhead, or a cottonmouth. And then, of course, there are some more dramatic theories, we'll say. Like, is it possible that there's a supernatural or even mythical explanation for his disappearance? Now, from my observation, there's been an outsized amount of discussion about, like, Bigfoot somehow being involved with Dennis's disappearance. And don't get me wrong, you know, that's something that always gets brought up by at least somebody whenever there's a disappearance in the woods. But it seems to really have caught on for this particular story. I mean, I see people talking about it all the time. Of course, it kind of depends on where you look, but this Sasquatch theory is, you know, often presented as a possible explanation for Dennis's disappearance. And look, I'm not here to like call out anyone specifically. I don't even really have anyone specifically in mind while I'm saying this. And I'm also not going to pretend that I know what happened to Dennis Martin. I most certainly don't. I mean, there's definitely something strange, even something mysterious about this story. But at the same time, it seems perfectly plausible to me that Dennis just disappeared, you know, without having to resort to like Bigfoot to explain it. I've covered a lot of stories about people who went missing while they were hiking or in the woods on this channel. And in a lot of those stories, they're pretty baffling. Like, there's really just no explanation. Like what the hell happened, you know? But in this particular story, I really do feel like it's realistic that Dennis probably wandered away from the campsite. You know, he was trying to hide or whatever. And then he probably got lost in the thick woods and then traveled in the wrong direction. The storms came in, the weather got bad, and that combined with the absolute mess of a search resulted in him never being found. And so despite all of the lore that surrounds this case, the mystery, in my humble opinion, that is almost certainly what happened. And it is kind of interesting to me how this story in particular has been so like heavily associated with Bigfoot. Apparently there were like some sightings of Bigfoot around the time. I don't know. And I could be wrong too. And the truth is that nobody knows for sure what happened, because despite the biggest search in Great Smoky Mountain National Park's history, Dennis Martin's fate remains the Appalachian Trail's darkest secret to this day. I mean, the search cost over $70,000, which is over $500,000 in today's money, and yet we still don't know. Bill Martin, Dennis's father, died in 2014 without getting any closure on his son's disappearance, and Spence Field, where all of this started, has since been taken over by tree growth. That's how I remember it, hardly resembling a field anymore at all. My heart goes out to Dennis Martin, of course, Bill Martin, and the rest of the Martin family. And though this case is sad, there is a silver lining here. This tragedy directly resulted in improved search procedures not just throughout the park or throughout the United States, but literally throughout the world. It's basically been a case study in what not to do in terms of search and rescue. And therefore, this story has likely saved many, many lives. And so I wanted to leave you with that perspective. Please show some love for Dennis and the rest of his family, Bill and Clyde certainly, in the comments section. YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy watching this video next, and so go give that a click. And guys, thank you for letting me retell this story. I promise I won't make a habit out of it. It just happened to work out this time. And I'll see you in the next video.